My sister called cops on my 6-year-old son, but a neighbor's security camera changed everything. She accused him of pushing her baby out of a crib, screaming assault, as police arrived. My sister once called the cops on my 6-year-old boy, and what finally came out afterwards still twists my gut to this day. My name's Mike, I'm 35, and even now thinking back on this makes my chest feel tight. It all started back in April, when my own sister actually reported my 6-year-old son to the police. And yeah, I know how insane that sounds, because he was barely a first grader. She claimed he tried to hurt her baby, and what followed didn't just damage our family, it pretty much shattered whatever was left of it, until a neighbor's security camera ended up dragging the truth into the light. That Sunday was meant to be calm and easy. My wife, Laura, and I had gone over to my parents' house for lunch. Nothing special, just family time. My sister Karen was already there, staying with Mom and Dad while her husband was out of town for work. She'd just had her first child 3 months earlier, a little girl named Lily, and my parents were completely obsessed. Mom was snapping photo after photo like she was on a mission. Dad looked proud like he'd just hit the jackpot, and meanwhile my son Noah sat off to the side. He was 6, legs dangling from a stool that was too tall for him, quietly watching everyone crowd around the baby. I caught the look in his eyes that one kids get when they suddenly feel forgotten. He tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Dad, do they like the baby more than me?" That one question hit me harder than any shouting match ever could. I gave him the usual reassurance, told him he was special and nobody could ever replace him. But even as I said it, I noticed Karen staring at us from across the room, arms crossed, judgment all over her face. She leaned toward Laura and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Don't you think your son's jealous of Lily? He keeps staring at her." Laura shut it down immediately, calm but firm, saying Noah's a sweet kid and he's just getting used to things, and honestly that should have been the end of it. It wasn't even close. Right then my phone rang, and of course it was the insurance adjuster calling about the roof damage from the storm 2 weeks earlier. The timing couldn't have been worse. They told me if we didn't handle it that day, we'd lose the claim. Laura and I went back and forth for a minute and finally decided to leave Noah with my parents and Karen, just for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. My parents had watched him plenty of times before, so it felt safe, because it was family, right? Before we walked out, I knelt beside Noah and told him Grandma and Grandpa were there, that he was safe, and that we'd be back soon. He nodded, but there was a look in his eyes, a small flash of worry that I still can't shake, and I should have paid attention to it. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again, and this time it was my sister screaming that my son had attacked her baby and that the police were already on their way. I'm not exaggerating when I say that call froze me in place, because my chest locked up like my body forgot how breathing worked. Karen was yelling nonstop, words spilling over each other, saying my son had deliberately tried to hurt her child. At first I honestly thought she had to be joking, like some twisted, awful joke, until she said the words that still echo in my head. I called the police. The police on my 6-year-old boy. I remember gripping my phone so hard my knuckles burned. I asked her what she was even talking about, and told her Noah would never hurt anyone, especially not a baby. She cut me off, completely hysterical, telling me not to defend him and claiming she saw him push Lily out of the crib onto the floor. When I repeated that to Laura, all the color drained from her face and she grabbed the phone, telling Karen in that quiet, dangerous voice she uses when she's barely holding it together to stop talking until we got there and not to do anything else. We ran to the car and took off. The drive back took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. At first neither of us said a word, just replaying the same questions in our heads about how this could even be happening. And then Laura started whispering to herself that Karen had lost her mind. When we pulled into the driveway, my heart sank because there were 2 police cars out front, 2 of them, for a 6-year-old kid. I sprinted up the walkway and almost slipped on the porch. Inside, everything was chaos. 2 officers stood in the living room, one older and steady, the other young and stiff like he was fresh out of training. My parents looked wrecked, my mom crying, and my dad red-faced with anger he was barely holding back. Karen sat on the couch clutching Lily like a shield, mascara streaked down her face, sobbing. And Noah was curled up behind an armchair, shaking like he was freezing even though the house was warm. When he saw me, his lips started trembling and I crouched beside him, telling him Dad was there and he was safe. Through tears, he whispered that he didn't hurt the baby and swore he was telling the truth. And in that exact moment, every protective instinct in me went into overdrive. I stood up and told the officers my name and that Noah was my son and asked someone to explain what was going on. The older officer stepped forward with a notebook and said they'd received a report that my son pushed an infant out of her crib. Laura gasped and said he was 6 years old and asked if they were seriously treating this like a crime. Karen jumped up yelling that we didn't see what she saw and that Noah was standing there and Lily was crying on the floor, so what else could it have been? I turned to my dad and asked if he saw anything, and he quietly said they were in the kitchen and only heard Karen scream. So no one actually saw what happened, just a crying baby, a terrified little boy, and a sister who was convinced she already knew the answer. That's when it hit me how bad this really was, because Karen truly believed my son had done something terrible. The room felt like it was closing in, everyone talking at once, Karen crying, Laura arguing, my mom begging everyone to calm down, while Noah stayed silent in the corner, shaking. Finally, the older cop raised his voice and told everyone to sit down so they could figure out what really happened. Then he crouched beside Noah and softened his tone, asking him to explain, and my son started to speak in a tiny, broken voice between hiccups. I was playing with my cars when the baby started crying, and then Aunt Karen went into the kitchen, and after that I heard a loud bump, so I looked up and saw her falling, and I tried to grab her, but I couldn't, he said. The officer nodded and gently asked, "You tried to catch her?" Noah nodded again, rubbing his eyes with his sleeve as he sniffled, and said she landed on the carpet and that he told her he was sorry, but then Aunt Karen came back and started yelling at him. Laura squeezed my arm so hard it actually hurt, and she said, "You hear that? That makes sense. He didn't push anyone. He tried to help." But Karen just shook her head, her eyes frantic, saying no, that she saw him standing by the crib and that babies don't just fall out of cribs on their own. I was about to snap back when a hard knock echoed through the front door and everyone went completely still. One of the officers opened it, and our neighbor Tom stood there, a retired guy in his 70s who waved every morning while mowing his lawn, holding a tablet and looking uncomfortable. He apologized for interrupting and said he saw the police cars and thought he might have something important. The officer asked what kind of something, and Tom explained that his security cameras faced our side windows and sometimes caught part of the living room when the curtains were open, and that after seeing the cruisers he checked the footage. He lifted the tablet and said it showed what happened. The silence after that was unbearable, and I told him to show us. Tom set the tablet on the coffee table, and the screen lit up with a grainy but clear view of my parents' living room, the crib, the couch, and sunlight pouring through the window. Noah was on the floor with his toy cars spread around him, and Lily was in the crib, gently kicking. On the video, Karen walked out of frame toward the kitchen, and after a few seconds Lily started squirming more, kicking harder, rolling toward the edge, the crib rocking once, then twice, until just like Noah said she rolled over the side. Noah jumped up immediately, ran to the crib with his arms out, too short and too late, and Lily fell, while he stumbled forward and dropped to his knees beside her. Then Karen rushed back in, grabbed Lily, and started yelling, and that was the end of the clip. When the video stopped, no one spoke. My mom covered her mouth, my dad's face drained of color, Laura's eyes filled with tears of pure relief, and Karen looked like the ground had disappeared under her. The older officer cleared his throat and said that cleared things up and that my son hadn't pushed anyone and had actually tried to stop the fall. Karen collapsed back onto the couch, pale as a ghost, and started to say she thought, but I cut in, standing up with my voice low and sharp, telling her she thought wrong and that she'd called the police on a 6-year-old who was trying to protect her baby. Laura's voice shook as she told her that she didn't just scare him, she broke something that might never heal. For once, my sister, who was always loud and dramatic, had nothing to say. The room stayed frozen, the only sounds Lily's soft whimpers and the hum of the refrigerator, and the truth hit everyone in a different way. My mom cried quietly like she was apologizing without words. My dad looked back and forth between us in disbelief, and Noah clung to my leg like letting go meant I'd disappear. The officer nodded and said they'd file a report noting there was no intent or harm, then turned to Karen and warned her that calling law enforcement on a child without being sure could have serious consequences. That hit harder than anything else. Karen's lips trembled as she said she panicked, and Laura stepped forward, furious, asking how panic justified accusing a 6-year-old of assault, screaming at him, and letting police question him like a criminal. Karen broke down sobbing and clutching Lily, but Laura didn't soften, telling her she traumatized our son because she couldn't stand the idea of being wrong. I couldn't even look at my sister anymore, only at Noah, still shaking and watching everyone like the world might turn on him again. And I picked him up, held him tight, and whispered that it was over and he did nothing wrong. He buried his face in my neck and cried like his whole heart was pouring out. After the police left, the house stayed trapped in that horrible silence, my parents lost and ashamed, my mom wringing her hands, and my dad finally admitting they should have believed him. I turned to Laura and said we were going home, and she agreed instantly. As I gathered Noah's things, my mom begged me not to leave like this, but Laura snapped that there was nothing to talk about after their daughter called the cops on our child. My dad said we were family and had made a terrible mistake, and I stopped at the door, holding Noah, and told him family believes you and doesn't assume the worst about an innocent child. And what happened wasn't family, it was betrayal. Then I walked out. The drive home was silent except for Noah's tired sobs, and Laura held his little fingers from the front seat the whole way. At home, Noah climbed into my lap and didn't want food or cartoons, just kept whispering that he tried to save the baby, and I told him I knew and that he was brave and did everything right. But later that night, as I carried him to bed, I knew the damage had already been done. Because when I turned off the lamp that night, my son asked me the one question I had no answer for, and it hit me harder than anything else he'd said through all of it. Dad, why didn't they believe me? From that moment on, everything felt different, because you can't just press reset after something like that. It sticks in the air between people even when nobody's talking about it. That same night, Noah had his first nightmare, and around 2 in the morning I jolted awake to a sound I'll carry with me forever, his scream, not a cry or a sleepy whimper, but a raw, terrified scream like someone was hurting him. I ran to his room with my heart hammering and found him sitting straight up in bed, eyes open but not really seeing me, repeating over and over that the police were taking him away. Laura rushed in behind me, and we held him together, whispering that he was safe and nobody was taking him anywhere. But even after he finally drifted back to sleep, he clung to my arms so tight I couldn't move. It didn't stop there either, because the nightmares kept coming, sometimes twice a night, sometimes 3 times, and during the day, he wouldn't let either of us out of his sight. If I went to the bathroom, he waited outside the door, and if Laura ran to the store, he cried until she came back. We talked to his teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, and she'd already noticed how much he'd changed, how my once happy, curious little boy now flinched when voices got loud, wouldn't play with the other kids, and barely spoke in class. She asked gently if something had happened at home, and when we told her, the color drained from her face, and she quietly said that poor child, and I knew exactly who she meant. At the same time, my phone wouldn't stop lighting up with calls and messages from my parents and from Karen, apologies mixed with excuses and justifications, my dad sending long texts about misunderstandings and protecting Lily, my mom leaving tearful voicemails, and Karen writing paragraphs that all started with "I was scared." Laura intercepted most of it and made sure no one never saw any of it, telling me they didn't get to fix this with words because they broke something in him and they could sit with that. Then one afternoon a package showed up on our porch, and inside was the remote control car Noah had been begging for months. No note, but we knew exactly who sent it. Laura didn't hesitate for a second. She walked outside and dropped it straight into the trash bin, and when I asked if that was too harsh, she looked at me with tired but fierce eyes and said no, they don't get to buy forgiveness. That was when it really sank in that this wasn't just about Noah's trauma anymore. It had cracked all of us open, Laura's anger, my guilt, my parents' shame, Karen's desperation, because our family was already damaged before that day, but afterward it was shattered, and everyone else was pretending they could glue it back together without acknowledging the cracks. About 3 weeks later, my dad showed up at our house without warning, no call, no text, just walked in like he still had an open invitation. I was working from home. Noah was in the living room building a tower out of blocks, and the second he saw his grandfather step inside, his face went pale, the tower collapsed, and he bolted upstairs like a frightened animal. Dad stood there watching his grandson run from him, shoulders slumping for a moment before he covered it with that familiar authority he'd always used to control our family, saying he just wanted to talk. I stepped into the hallway and told him he needed to leave, and when he said he came to apologize and make things right, I pointed out that he saw how Noah reacted and that all of them had scared him that day. Dad said he was Noah's grandfather and that he'd get over it. And that was the sentence that set me off. I stepped closer and told him Noah was 6 years old, that the police had been called on him, that he was having nightmares every night, and that this wasn't something he could just get over. My dad's face tightened, and that old pride crept back as he accused me of coddling him. And I took a deep breath and told him what wasn't helping was pretending Noah wasn't traumatized just because it made him feel better. When he muttered that I was turning Noah against them and that this was my fault, I stared at him in disbelief and told him I was teaching my son boundaries, something this family had never understood. He didn't like that at all, his face turning red, and without planning to, I told him he needed to leave or I'd call the police, the irony hanging heavy between us. He stormed out muttering about raising weak kids, and I shut the door with my hands shaking, hearing Noah's bedroom door open upstairs as he softly asked if his grandfather was gone. And when I told him yes, I realized I'd just chosen sides for good. About 6 weeks later, my mom showed up, no warning, her little sedan pulling into the driveway like it always had, probably full of casseroles and guilt, and Laura told me quietly that I could handle it because she wasn't ready to face her yet. Mom came in holding a plastic container like a peace offering, her eyes already wet, begging to talk, and after a long silence I told her that Noah still hid when he saw her car. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes, and she said she never wanted any of this and thought she was protecting Karen. And who was protecting my son, Mom? I asked in a low, steady voice, and she completely fell apart, sobbing as she said she knew she failed both of us and didn't know how to say no because Karen was crying and scared. I nodded slowly and told her she'd always rushed in to fix things for her, even when she was the one breaking them, and my mom wiped her eyes and asked if we could fix this and begged me to tell her how. I leaned forward with my elbows on my knees and explained that trust doesn't get fixed the same way, that once it breaks you can glue it back together, but it never looks the same again. She stared at the floor and whispered that she hated what she'd done to Noah, and even though I wanted to stay angry, seeing her so small and wrecked cracked something in me too. I told her I knew she loved him, but love doesn't erase what happened, and that trust had to be earned back slowly, and she nodded through her tears and said she'd do whatever it took. When she stood up to leave, she paused and asked if she could see him for just a second, and after hesitating I called upstairs that Grandma was there. Noah peeked around the corner clutching his stuffed dinosaur, half hidden, and my mom smiled weakly and whispered hello, and Noah looked at me first, so I nodded, and he gave the smallest wave before disappearing back upstairs. My mom pressed a hand to her chest and let out a shaky breath, saying that was enough for now. And after she left I stood in the doorway watching her drive away while Laura joined me and asked if I thought she meant it. I told her that for the first time I really thought she did, even though we both knew one apology couldn't undo what fear had broken. 2 months went by before Karen called again, and I hadn't planned on answering, but Ethan was asleep and the house was quiet, and part of me wanted to hear what she'd say. Her voice sounded small and fragile as she begged me not to hang up, and I stayed silent while she said she'd started seeing a therapist and knew that didn't erase what she did, but she wasn't trying to ruin our lives. She was terrified and convinced Noah was jealous. I finished the thought for her, telling her she believed her nephew was a monster, and after a long silence she admitted she couldn't live with it and saw Noah's face every night, especially the look he gave her when the police were there, and her voice broke as she said she couldn't escape it. I told her flatly that she shouldn't be able to escape it, that she should remember it, and when she whispered asking how to make it right, I leaned back and stared at the dark ceiling and told her some things don't get fixed, you just live with the damage you caused. I told her she didn't just accuse my son of something awful, she shattered his trust in family and safety, and that kind of harm can't be apologized away. She cried softly and said she was scared, and I told her I understood fear, but that it doesn't give you permission to destroy someone else's peace, and that she never called me or checked. She went straight to the police. She said she hated herself for it, and I told her she should, and that I hoped she hated it long enough to learn from it. After a long pause, she asked if I thought Noah would ever forgive her, and I told her that wasn't up to me, that if he ever was ready it would be his choice, and until then she needed to stay away and respect our boundaries. She agreed, and I hung up without saying goodbye, feeling the full weight of the anger, the sadness, and the hollow space where forgiveness might never exist. Laura came out of the bedroom and asked if it was her, and when I said yes, and that she just wanted to feel better, Laura reminded me softly that it wasn't my job, and we stood there together in that heavy silence, knowing some family wounds never close, they just scar. By summer, Noah started smiling again, at least on the surface, playing outside, riding his bike, laughing at the neighbor's dog, but I could still see that tiny flinch living under his skin, like he'd learned the world could turn on him without warning. At school he was polite and gentle, almost too careful, and his teacher told me he asked permission for everything, even sharpening his pencil, saying he was sweet but didn't trust that he wouldn't get in trouble, and that one cut deep. Laura and I worked hard to give him back the joy that day stole from him, taking trips to the lake, building pillow forts, starting family game nights where he always picked the first move, and slowly he began to feel safe again. My parents were allowed short, supervised visits at our house once a month, sitting quietly on the couch while Mom brought cookies and Dad brought long, awkward silences, and Noah was polite and thankful, but the easy love he once had for them was gone. One night at dinner, Noah asked why Grandma and Grandpa didn't believe him that day, and even though we'd expected the question, it still froze us, and I told him that sometimes adults make terrible choices when they're scared and stop thinking clearly. He asked if they'd ever do it again, and I promised they wouldn't and that I'd make sure of it. Even though I knew kids don't forget, they just store the pain until they're old enough to unpack it. By the time fall arrived, Noah had turned 7, the nightmares fading into a quiet carefulness, and at the grocery store if a toddler dropped something nearby, he'd step back with his hands behind his back, just so no one could ever say it was him. A 7-year-old already learning how to prove he's innocent before anyone even points a finger, and every time I noticed it, that familiar anger tightened in my chest, not just toward Karen, but toward every adult in that living room who failed him when it counted most, including my own parents. Trust doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. That's the thing about it. It wears down slowly until one day you realize there's nothing left to hold on to. Thanksgiving showed up before I even understood how fast the year had slipped by, and Laura and I decided we'd host it ourselves. No drama, no surprises, no walking into someone else's emotional minefield. We told my parents they were welcome to come for a few hours if they wanted, but Karen wasn't invited, not yet, and maybe not ever. Noah helped Laura in the kitchen, wearing a tiny apron that said Mom's chef in training, sprinkling salt like it was glitter while humming to himself, and seeing him happy again, even just for an afternoon, felt like finally breathing clean air after being underwater for months. My parents arrived right on time, Mom carrying a pie and Dad wearing that careful smile he uses when he isn't sure where he stands, and Noah opened the door but didn't rush into their arms like he used to, just said hello to them politely, like a host greeting guests. They followed his lead, no forced hugs, no big emotional moments, just quiet conversation about school projects, cartoons, and favorite snacks, and it was fragile, but it was something. Halfway through dinner, my dad cleared his throat and apologized again, and Mom nodded through watery eyes saying they should have believed Noah, and they should have believed us. I wanted to say everything was fine and we'd moved on, but that wouldn't have been honest, so instead I told them that what mattered now was showing him he was safe, because actions would mean more than anything they could say to me. After dinner, Noah brought out the board game we'd promised to play, and for a little while it almost felt normal again. Laughter, crumbs on the table, dice rolling, until my dad tried to joke about the past, saying Grandpa wasn't so scary, right? And Noah froze, his hand tightening around the dice. Laura stepped in immediately, her voice gentle but firm, saying he never should have been scared in the first place, and the silence that followed was heavy until my dad looked down and quietly admitted she was right. When they left that night, Mom hugged Noah goodbye, and he didn't hug back, just stood still like he wasn't sure if it was allowed, but he didn't pull away either, and that felt like progress in its smallest form. Later, after the house was clean and Noah was asleep, Laura sat beside me on the couch and asked if I thought he'd ever trust them again, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, but I thought he was learning what love was supposed to look like, and for now that was enough. Christmas came faster than I was ready for, lights everywhere, the neighborhood looking like a holiday movie, and every cheerful song on the radio felt like it was mocking how fractured things still were. Laura and I went back and forth about inviting my parents, but Noah made the choice for us when he said he didn't want to go to their house and asked if they could come to ours instead. So we hosted. Laura's parents came too, bringing the warmth and normalcy we badly needed. And when my mom offered to help in the kitchen, Laura gently kept her at the table, letting her just be present. My dad tried to make small talk with Noah about school and cartoons, but it felt awkward, like strangers borrowing memories that didn't belong to them anymore. And Karen wasn't mentioned at all, not even indirectly, like saying her name might shatter the thin peace we'd built. After dinner, Noah opened a gift from my parents, a book about space, thanked them politely, and started reading it right away. But when my dad leaned closer to look, Noah shifted away just slightly, not rude, just enough to say he still wasn't sure, and something in my father's face cracked, like guilt had finally settled deep into him. That night, after everyone left, Laura and I sat by the fire watching Noah quietly build a Lego set, humming to himself, and she whispered that he was doing better, and I agreed, but said there was still something in him now, like he'd learned the world could turn on him without warning. Laura nodded, saying maybe that wasn't something he'd ever fully unlearn, and I stared into the fire thinking about that day in April, about how fear had ripped through our family like a storm, and how quickly love had turned into suspicion. And I knew then that what broke wasn't just trust, it was innocence, his and mine. Because once you see family choose fear over faith, you never see them the same way again. A year has passed since that April day, but sometimes it still feels close enough to touch, especially in quiet moments when I see Noah reading in his room or laughing with Laura, and suddenly picture the terrified little boy curled up in that living room corner, and every time I have to remind myself that he survived it. We all did, just not without scars. Noah turned 7 last month, and we threw a small party at home with his school friends and a few neighbor kids, laughter filling the house in that wild, joyful way that rattles the walls, and for a few hours he was just a kid again. No fear, no memories, no tightness behind his eyes. My parents stopped by briefly, having learned how to be quiet around him and how to earn trust in inches instead of miles. Mom helping him cut the cake with hands that shook just a little, while Dad stayed in the background, watching with a look that felt like penance. Karen sent a letter instead of a gift, pages full of carefully chosen words, apologies crossed out and rewritten, admitting she couldn't undo what she'd done and that she knew she'd taken something from him and from me. I showed the letter to Noah, and he read it slowly, sounding out the bigger words, then handed it back and said he wasn't ready to see her yet, and I told him that was okay, and that he got to decide if and when he ever was. Sometimes I still catch him watching adults carefully, like he's measuring who's safe, not fearful anymore, just different, thoughtful and cautious in a way no 7-year-old should have to be, and I hate that, because childhood is supposed to be messy and loud and safe, not something that comes with a survival guide. Laura and I still talk about that day sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, knowing it changed everything, not just how we see my family, but how we understand love, because love isn't just about who you forgive, it's about who you protect. We built something solid out of the wreckage, real boundaries, forgiveness that has to be earned, and a kind of peace that doesn't depend on pretending, and my parents are trying, and maybe one day Karen will be allowed in the same room again, but it'll happen on Noah's terms, not theirs. Last week, while we were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down, Noah said something that nearly stopped my heart when he told me he thought he knew what being brave meant, and when I asked him what he meant, he thought for a moment and said it meant doing the right thing even when everyone thinks you're wrong. And right then I felt the weight I'd been carrying for a year lift just a little, because he wasn't defined by what happened to him. He was growing through it, and while I don't know if my family will ever fully heal, I do know this: fear can destroy, but truth can rebuild, one quiet act of bravery at a time, and my son, my little boy who tried to save a baby that day, showed all of us what real courage looks like.